You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. You know, I thought about starting off this show at like a 9 and revving it up to a 13 and screaming for 30 minutes about Jerry Reinsdorf being cheap and yelling about how this team is just purposely losing now to make us all angry so the owner can go to Major League Baseball and say, hey, nobody likes me anymore here. Can I move the team? Like I was angry about Chris Getz saying that they're not going to be in free agency heavy in the offseason when this team is on its way to a historical loss total. And I was even angrier when Bob Nightingale reported that the payroll is going to be decreased, Ed. But I woke up this morning and chose a different path.
What kind of a path? I mean, because I think everybody's reaction was the same to Chris Getz. You're immediately upset because we want to see wholesale changes to the worst team in Major League history, right? You don't want to see the same old, and the payroll reduction, I think, was, I mean, that's if you're surprised by that, honestly, I don't know where you've been for the past 40 years, but this was sort of fait accompli that you were going to lose payroll. But I mean, is there reason to think that there could be a good offseason for the White Sox? Is there reason to think that we could have hope?
Yes, because I found $50 million for free agents. I found $50 million reducing Jerry Reinsdorf's payroll by 40, and I want you to join me on this journey because by the time it's over, you will not accept that it isn't Chris Getz's fault if he has a bad offseason. It will not matter that the old man is reducing payroll after you're done listening to what I think Getz can go and do in the offseason, even with a reduced payroll. And I'm slashing payroll right off the bat by $40 million, bringing them into the bottom 5. I think they would rank at this point if they had the payroll that I'm going to give them, $93 million. I'm going to slash $40 million off of the $133 million price tag right now, according to SpotTrack. I'm going to drop $40 million off this payroll and still find $50 million for Chris Getz to spend so that he can do something to improve the team while he continues to grow whatever talent exists within the organization. This episode of Sox in the Basement brought to you proudly by Cork and Carry at the Park and the Shadow of the Ballpark at 33rd and Princeton. I was there this weekend, ran into a couple of listeners. That place is still fun to go to, win or lose. They actually won, I know, a couple games now in a row. Isn't that amazing? Watch this team find a way to fail at making history after putting us through this. Watch them do that. Watch them just go on an incredible run, and then they don't get the historic loss record. Which on one hand, like, I'll be disappointed because I feel like we've earned it, Ed. But on the other hand, like, it shows some fight, and there's got to be a point where I start to see that. But anyway, there is an incredible bar at Cork and Carry at the Park. There's indoor, outdoor seating. The food is amazing. We ate. I found a way to essentially go to the game for nearly free, at least when it comes to what I spent with Jerry Reinsdorf. I went to Cork and Carry and fed the kids. I bought a $7 ticket for my oldest kid. The other 2 tickets were free because my kid won something in grammar school or got some sort of thing where they were giving out free tickets. And I went and watched the win and barely spent any money. And I want to thank Cork and Carry at the Park for that. I would rather spend my money with them. See everything they have to offer. Check out that amazing menu and support them always at corkandcarry.com. All right, here's how I'm going to start this off. There's going to be a little math, but I'm going to try to make this as easy to follow as possible. And I want you to keep in mind the 2023 to 2024 Kansas City Royals. In 2023, the Kansas City Royals had a $96 million payroll and went 56-106. At the same time, the White Sox had a $162.8 million payroll and went 61-101. And you know the old man, who's a miser, who should be investing more in his team, who's been a failure for 40 years. This is not me making excuses for him. But the old man looked and said, they spent an awful lot less money. They spent $50 million less almost, and they got the same result. So he saw that last year. And now we'll fast forward to 2024, where the Royals are a fairly good team. And they spent some money in the offseason, They raised their payroll to $120 million coming off of that terrible season. They're 82-69 currently. And meanwhile, the White Sox spent a little bit more, $13 million more and some change for a $133.9 million payroll. And they are 36-115 as we sit here right now. So the old man is sitting there saying to himself right now, why am I spending this money? I can't spend this money. Why would I, a multi-billionaire, do anything to fix this? It's all about the bottom line, and we're going to have to reduce payroll. So let's assume that the White Sox reduce payroll. And let's assume that the White Sox fall into the bottom 5 of Major League Baseball, which currently has Oakland at 30th at $62 million, and I don't think he goes that low. But let's look at some of the other teams that are right above Oakland. Pittsburgh's at $85 million. The Rays are at $88. Miami's at $97. Detroit's at $98. Let's drop right in the middle of those 4 teams. We'll reduce the payroll by $40 million for Jerry Reinsdorf. Like, this is what I would do. If all of a sudden I could walk in and be his general manager, I'd walk in and be like, you know what, Jerry? You're right. You give me this team, I'll reduce your payroll, and I'll still make it better next year. We'll take $40 million off the books right now, and I'll reduce the overall payroll to $93 million and some change.
Well, and look, preface this too by as you're thinking about this, any general manager can walk in and pick out, say, a dozen free agents that are a step up or 2 steps up or even a star player and put them in a lineup and make an off-season, splash and make it really work. You could, if you have the top end payroll in baseball, there's a lot of things that you can do and a lot of things that you can do quickly. We would love to see Jerry do that, but if Chris Getz has a good handle on talent, has a good handle on what he expects out of his team, how players work together, the interplay of what he wants to do offensively, defensively, and on the pitching staff, then you don't need to have a huge payroll, and you can look at Tampa Bay for that, where they will occasionally spend some money on a guy. A lot of times they rely on their farm system, but that's okay. But also they just have an eye for talent. Guys that they bring in aren't always flashy superstars. They're guys that fit their system. They're guys that fit their coaching. And that's what you're talking about right here, right?
Yes.
You can reduce the payroll, but you can still build a competent team.
All right, so here we go. $32.1 million is already gone, folks. You got to spend $32.1 million, or a third of that payroll about, on Luis Robert Jr. and Andrew Benintendi. You're locked into them. Then you're going to buy out Yoan Moncada for $5 million. You're going to buy out Max Stassi for $500,000. $5.5 million in buyouts. You have one retained salary, Brebbia, still $1 million next year. And you've got deferred salaries for Liam Hendricks and Jose Abreu that you're still paying combined $2.5 million. So you're already on the hook for all of that next year. And I looked at what everybody else currently on the roster is making pre-arbitration. They come in at about $14 million and change. I'm just going to round it to $15 million. Let's say if I were to keep everybody and just at around the same amount of money, because I'm going to talk arbitration, but let's just keep everybody around the same amount of money to start off this equation. $15 million for the whole rest of the team. That is $56 million. And I want to slash, Ed. I want to slash from that $56 million I'm walking into next year before I start building.
So you don't want to go through arbitration with some of these guys, is what you're saying.
No, because you know what? You all suck.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, let's face it. It's more, I think the more disheartening thing about Chris Getz saying they're not going to be heavy in free agency is the idea that guys are coming back more so than that, you're not going to get new guys in. It's just, I don't want to see Nicky Lopez anymore. You
don't need to bring back these guys. In fact, what I did is I listed everybody that is currently making $1 million or more that is not named Luis Robert Jr. or Andrew Benintendi, that is arbitration eligible, pre-arbitration eligible. Here we go. Mike Soroka. I'm not giving him $3 million next year. He's got a whip at about 1.5. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Chris Flexen. Everybody's like, should we bring back Chris Flexen? Why? Why do you need to give him $2 million when you have all these other young pitchers that you want to see? You have other issues besides needing a Chris Flexen around. You don't need him. Dominic Leone, bye. A relief pitcher with a whip where he's putting on more than a batter and a half every time he goes out there. I don't care. You're gone. You're making too much money. Nicky Lopez. Did you know the average win above replacement was around $5 million? In fact, here it is, $5.7 million for position players. That's how much a WAR is, a win above replacement. Nicky Lopez got you 1/10 of that for $4.3 million this year. Nicky Lopez.
He's just too expensive for what he is.
And don't tell me he's one of the young guys that are going to improve. He's old. All right? Nicky Lopez has played long enough in Major League Baseball for me to look at his baseball card and say what he did this year is his average year. And his average year is flatline replacement level. He doesn't get $4.3 million. Re-signing Nicky Lopez in arbitration would be just as egregious, in fact, more egregious than giving the money they gave to Leury Garcia a few years ago. Because you're paying for something that isn't there. There's nothing that he does except the fact that you traded away a relief pitcher to get 5 lotto tickets, and Jared Schuster is probably the best thing you got out of it.
But honestly, if you had traded Aaron Bummer straight up for Jared Schuster, I think we all would have been like, man, good job.
Right. So I'm moving on from him, and here's the other name. Here's the other name right here. Remember that amount, $5.7 million for one batting WAR was the average that teams have paid. If you look back at 2023 when they sorted it all out. Andrew Vaughn made $3.25 million in arbitration. Are you giving him a raise for being below 1/2 WAR? Because he didn't earn that either for everything he's done. Now, I know he's been hot over the last 30 days, and I know he's been hitting. So if you want to say, oh, we won't clear that one, okay, that doesn't really make a big mess in my plans if you really want to keep Andrew Vaughn. But I'm going to say get rid of him, because when I get rid of him, and I get rid of Enyel De Los Santos. I mean, this guy's making way too much money to suck. All these guys are on the payroll. $12.4 million comes off the books, and I am currently walking into the 2025 season with only $43.6 million pre-crochet arbitration. And I have $50 million in space before I get to the 93 and change after the $40 million payroll reduction. I just created $50 million, and now I want to talk about how we're going to spend the $50 million. Sox in the Basement listeners, switch to a new age of life with Hyatt Home Medical Equipment located on the South Side. Hyatt is your one-stop shop to keep mom and dad, grandma and grandpa out of assisted living, make it so they can get around on their own and live independently. Hyatt's all about stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, and even bathroom remodeling, and they work with your insurance. 0% financing for qualified individuals. If you have a CPAP machine or know somebody that needs a better one, if you're unhappy with your vendor, switch and get supplies directly mailed to you. They also have the latest and greatest in continuous glucose monitors and so much more. Learn everything about Hyatt Home Medical Equipment and check out their big, beautiful showroom. See more at hhme.com. Meanwhile, I have created $50 million after slashing 40 off of the payroll.
Well, and for those people who are sitting there going, well, why not try and trade these guys? Why not try and, they still may have value? That is always a possibility. But the reality is that somebody like Nicky Lopez, if somebody's going to pay Nicky Lopez $4 or $5 million, he's a complimentary player on the Dodgers, right? He's a guy that backs up their middle infield. For a team that's looking to slash payroll, for a lot less, what he does, Brooks Baldwin can do for you.
Right. That's the thing. You don't need to pay for a Nicky Lopez at this point. You don't have the money for it. That's like a family that's just getting by paycheck to paycheck, saying, "Well, yeah, but we got to set aside money for that weekend trip, and we're gonna rent out an Airbnb." And you're like, "Whoa, what are you putting that on?" They're like, "Credit card," and they're never paying that off. That's what Nicky Lopez is. If you're going to be a team that slashes your payroll, which they're going to do, and you're going to go down into the bottom 5, which we are accounting for, and we're figuring that you drop at $40 million, you don't want to waste the $50 million I just created on Nicky Lopez. And you have to question, do you want to waste the $50 million on Andrew Vaughn? Because even though he had a crap season, I bet you that's a $5 million price tag next year, or $4.5 million for Andrew Vaughn next year, even though he was bad. So you take Lopez and Vaughn and you have $40 million instead of $50. Do you want to give up $10 million for those two players right now after what you just watched this year?
$10 million is a starting pitcher. $10 million is an above replacement level player in the outfield.
Right. Would you trade Nicky Lopez and Andrew Vaughn right now for a legit starting right fielder? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you would. You would do that. And you could take the money from them and use that to get that because you don't need them. You have Gavin Sheets who can stand at first base. This again goes back to the argument. And yes, he's going to get an increase in money. So he's going to eat into my $50 million a little bit, but he ain't going to eat into it as much as Andrew Vaughn. He's not. And Nicky Lopez, again, can be replaced by a Brooks Baldwin. Lenin Sosa is hitting over 300 over the last 30 days. I just watched him on Sunday go out and hit really well. So yes, he's got an awful lot of flaws, but why do I got to pay Nicky Lopez when I have those two names on my roster?
You don't need any of those guys.
Here's the thing. You don't need to bring back these guys, Ed. You don't need to bring back guys that are on arbitration just because they're part of your program, just because they were part of your team. You can let them go. And I will point to the Pittsburgh Pirates, a team whose payroll will probably be around next year. And the Pittsburgh Pirates, when their last GM, Neil Huntington, left, Ben Cherington came in, who had been with Boston, and he took that 1 year and looked at his team like Getz did. Even though we were told he wasn't going to need that, that's what Getz did. Well, now Getz has had a year sitting there as a GM, and he's got to do the same thing that Cherington did. Cherington just didn't offer arbitration to the majority of his players. He just let them all go. He had Gregory Polanco on a bad deal with guaranteed money. He had that one relief pitcher that went to jail for terrible things that was guaranteed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And those are the only two he couldn't clear. And then he didn't offer arbitration to like 90% of his young players because he had just watched them for a season and said, why would I give this guy $5 million when he isn't part of the long-term plan? So if Ben Cherington was able to do it a couple of years ago, and other general managers have done it over the last couple of years, what's to say that Chris Getz should feel any obligation to offer arbitration to Andrew Vaughn, should have any obligation to offer arbitration to Nicky Lopez? He doesn't have the obligation to do so. And he has to start weighing, do I want to take those two salaries alone and create $10 million for myself? Because if your owner's going to slash payroll, you have to now prove that you're a good GM. This is something that we've talked about on this show now for years.
You got to be ruthless. There can be very little player loyalty at this stage of the game.
Yes, but here's the other thing. As a general manager, you could blame an owner for being cheap. Jerry Reinsdorf's cheap. He's a bad businessman. He's terrible for baseball. He's one of the worst owners in the history of Major League Baseball and one of the worst owners in the history of Chicago sports. He makes Bill Wirtz possibly be the second worst. That's how bad he is. All right. Now,
but without ranting about him,
he is not an excuse for Chris Getz. Because a good general manager says, what do I have to work with? You have this. And then they do what I just did. A guy in his basement with a pen, a piece of paper I folded in half, and the internet went on and looked at what the salaries were, what you had to pay next year, what you could cut, and found $50 million even with a $40 million reduced payroll. And that is a realistic number for the White Sox next year, because that would place them dead center in the middle of the bottom 5 franchises in Major League Baseball. It would be a massive cut. It would bring them down to the area of where the Royals were last year. And Jerry likes to compare himself to these minor market teams that are within his division. That's where he's going to end up. And if you just start willy-nilly, we're just bringing the boys back to do it again, that's on Getz. That's on Getz even more than it is on Reinsdorf, because Getz doesn't need to bring them back.
No, that's as much as I would call out spending a bunch of money as lazy GM work, just bringing guys back and hoping that they get better is lazier GM work. That is sitting there going, it's either hubris or folly to sit there and say, I'm just going to bring back the same team that was, if not historically awful, just damn near it, and sit there and say nothing's going to get better. But to your point about those two salaries, and then, potentially moving on, here's a name I'll throw out who's making $10.9 million right now as a first baseman, and I think everybody would agree you'd rather have Christian Walker of the Arizona Diamondbacks.
Yes.
And his 2.6 WAR, his 257 average, his 26 home runs, his OPS that is only it's 8.27, an OPS plus of 1.27. He's an above average player, and he is making, to your point about Andrew Vaughn and Nicky Lopez going, if that was the trade, and Christian Walker was coming back to be, basically the guy in the middle of the lineup that's protecting Luis Robert Jr., you'd take that.
Right, and it goes back to the Verdugo argument I made recently, right? I think I had him at about 12 million is what his market value is supposed to be next year or something like that. And I was like, hey, his batting gloves has been making him break out in hives. And so they just got to change the material that he's using. And then all of a sudden the guy's not coming up with his hands all itchy while he's trying to swing. And there's no room for him in New York, and he's going to be a free agent. And he could be another guy that you could add in there, and you could afford him if you make that deal. Heck, Garrett Crochet. This is the 800-pound elephant in the room. Garrett Crochet, are they going to trade him or are they not going to trade him? Well, here's the deal. If they trade him and they go get younger guys, they trade him and they go get younger guys. But what if they didn't trade him? What if with the next 2 years of arbitration, where he's estimated, it would probably cost you about $10 to $15 million. Let's go on the high end. $15 million for the next 2 years of arbitration with Crochet. All right. Well, Nicky Lopez, $4.3 million. Andrew Vaughn, $3.25 million. I got myself at $7.55 million to give Garrett Crochet this year.
Okay. Yeah. Even if it's a miracle and it goes up to $10 million. You still got a ton of room to play with.
Right. You have a ton of room to play. And that's the thing. You can reduce payroll. The owner can reduce payroll. He's wrong to do it. But the general manager has incredible flexibility. Again, the only two guys he's married to that he can't get rid of are Luis Robert Jr. and Andrew Benintendi. The names that I came up with, the slash $12.4 million by not offering arbitration, they're the only ones making over $1 million. Everybody else, you can get rid of any of these other names I haven't mentioned too. They're all about $700,000 to $800,000. They're nothing. They're nothing to just release them and move on. You're only married to two players, $5.5 million in buyouts, $3.5 million in retained and deferred salaries. That's all you're married to. You have plenty of money to not be heavy in free agency, right? Like you're not going and getting Juan Soto, okay? If that's what you're trying to tell me, Chris, okay, fine. If Getsy's trying to say,
but just say that, Getsy. You know, if you're saying, yeah, just say that. We're not doing that.
We're not getting Alex Bregman or Juan Soto. Okay, fine. But you can go out and do what the Royals did last offseason, where they went out and they got role players and they got professional baseball players and they filled in amongst their young guys and they flipped a season where they lost over 100 games into a playoff season. You could do that. It's realistic. It's not an impossible thing to do. For crying out loud, at least try. Sox in the Basement listeners trying to make the most of your money. Give a call to Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor. Located on the corner of 111th and Kedzie, but serving the Chicagoland area, Tom has a get-to-know-you approach and a do-the-right-thing attitude. He's been doing this for decades. It's all about knowing your options when you're investing and planning for your retirement, no matter what stage you are at. It costs nothing to check in with Tom. Give Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor, a call today, 773-779-0023. Edward Jones, member SIPC. Here's the thing. I'm not giving Chris Getz any quarter this offseason. Nobody should allow him to hide behind my owner's cheap, because the owner could reduce the payroll by $40 million and you could still have plenty of money to make choices. It's your choices, though. You're the GM. I don't know why you're married to anybody that I've mentioned so far. You can move on from any player on this roster, and nobody on this roster has earned the right to be back next year. Not after this season. Nobody's earned a thing. So that's what I would do. And then I could look at my roster, Ed. Then I could look at my roster and I could start making decisions about what do I really want to keep, right? Okay. So again, you got the Sheets Vaughn argument. And Vaughn is going to cost you $5 million. And if all of a sudden you really do believe in him, because he's been hitting the crap out of the ball the last couple of weeks, right? But that's streaky. Every time he's good, Sheets drops down. Every time Sheets is good, Vaughn gets better. You never get them both at the same thing. And at the end of the year, you know what the average is going to be? Replacement level player. So you can move on from one of them and keep that space open, and you can go get a free agent. If you really believe that Lenin Sosa, who I'm going to bring up what he did over recently, because I was thinking about this the other day. I was out there at the ballpark on Sunday, and I'm watching Sosa, and he's playing well. And it was funny because I'm sitting next to my son Dominic, who's 16 years old, and Dominic is like, "Well, they won last night." And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, they're not going to win today." Like he was already resigned walking into the ballpark on Sunday. We're going to lose. He was astounded by the fact that they won the game. But while we're sitting there, he's like, "Who do you think's going to play well out here today?" We're having this discussion, father-son discussion. And I said, "Well, I would think Ramos is going to play well. Sosa's going to play well. And some of these guys that are really good in AAA are going to play well because J.P. Sears is on the mound." And Dominic had JP Sears on his fantasy baseball team this year and dropped him because he's a bum. And I'm like, he's a AAA pitcher pitching to AAA players. This is a AAA game. So we're going to see some really good results today from some of the guys that still haven't been able to figure out good major league pitching yet, but they're going to be able to eat this guy alive. And I think Sosa went 2 for 4. Ramos had a hell of a game. And you see, look at Sosa right now, last 15 days hitting 419, last 30 days hitting over 300. So like you may say, I want that guy. So you got a first baseman, you pick one of them, you keep him in your middle infield. You're going to let Ramos and Vargas fight for third. Okay, fine. You got Robert out in the outfield and Benintendi on this team. Benintendi should probably be half the time as a DH. The way he's hitting right now and the way that Sizemore is using him, it's perfect. You could really see the difference. Like
he's being used a lot better right now, too.
That is one of the positives of Grady Sizemore in there instead of Pedro Grifol. That is one of the, you can really see the difference. And you can even see Luis Robert Jr. starting to hit just a little bit more. It's not that great, but he had a laser that went off the top of the wall on Sunday. His stats are at least reasonable over the last couple of weeks. But that's what you have. And then you really don't have anything else. I mean, Corey Lee, I think, in the end, is just a backup catcher. You got to find another middle infielder in there, but you got Brooks Baldwin to start with, and you could go out into free agency and add a veteran presence because Colson Montgomery isn't coming anytime soon. Edgar Caro's probably going to be ready next year, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. You would do well to add an outfielder. You'd do well to add a right fielder and another bat. Add a right fielder and another bat, like you mentioned with Christian Walker, even if it's a DH, or add 2 outfielders and let Benintendi sometimes DH and put the other 2 guys that you added out in the outfield, however you could figure it. But you should be able to add 2 bats for the middle of your lineup without an issue with the money that's been created. And then you should be able to kind of tinker and find things that you want to adjust, and maybe you bring in a third free agent. But you could bring in 2-3 bats without a problem with $50 million in room if you're willing to make the cuts. I mean, think about a team right now if they do something like that. If they do something like that, they're not winning the division, but they're not losing 100 games next year. In reality, with young pitching coming along, I believe with young pitching coming along and a couple of legitimate bats, this team is not going to be as bad next year.
Well, and here's the thing, too, to consider what happens with the young guys. Whether you're talking about Miguel Vargas, who's got a spotty track record, Brian Ramos, who we've seen, and Lenyn Sosa, who we've both seen really, get hot and then get ice cold and be streaky and unpredictable.
I tend to lean towards Ramos, though, over Vargas because I saw Vargas get 81 games last year with the Dodgers, and I see what he's doing now. And I said at the moment we traded for him, I don't think this guy's that good. I know some people really like him because of his AAA stats. I don't think he's that good. I see a Ramos who walks around and believes, even if he's delusional, believes he's a superstar. Like, he believes it. He believes he's going to be great. And you need a crazy guy like that playing every day. I'd have him at third base every
100%.
Damn day. Yeah.
100%. And if Brian Ramos, if one of those guys wants to make the move to first, if you decide to move on from Andrew Vaughn, if you decide to move on from Gavin Sheets for that matter, that's fine too, or to platoon with him. But the idea that you're going to give some of these young guys a chance, even Colson Montgomery, who I know isn't coming anytime soon because he had a miserable year in AAA, there's obviously a lot more to do there. But if you're going to make the old White Sox mistake of kind of rushing him to the majors to see if he can learn on the job, okay, you know what? I will give some credence to that, even though this was the year to do the evaluation, not next year on those guys, and you should have been playing them all along if you're going to do that. But let's say that you've got some reason to believe that Brian Ramos can establish himself as an everyday player, that Brooks Baldwin can establish himself as an everyday player, that Lenyn Sosa can establish himself as an everyday player, that you have some level of confidence in these guys that they can become that replacement level or above replacement level player that you've been seeking at certain positions. Great. That's fine. That's one of the things that teams do to win is that they do find guys that don't become stars necessarily. I mean, it's great when they do, but they become solid supplemental players. They become solid guys that are part of your lineup that you can rely on for a certain average, a certain OPS. Then you still have to go out and you have to figure out where your weaknesses are, and you have to get some guys that are capable of helping all the boats rise. Okay, you got to find some high tide players here.
You have to have a couple of guys that are just professional baseball players, because you need stability for when the young guys are learning. If you put all of the weight on the shoulders of nothing but prospects and failed prospects that you're still wishing are going to get better, it's never going to work. That doesn't work. The old model of just tear it all down and every prospect will just rise together, doesn't really work.
Well, nobody does that. People will point to the Astros as the team that did that. But yes, the Astros do have a lot of guys that are homegrown guys. That's very true. But Justin Verlander was not an Astros homegrown guy. Yuli Gurriel was on that team. He's not an Astros homegrown guy. Michael Bradley.
Right.
Michael Bradley was their right field when they were winning in those World Series and when they were really, really dangerous as a lineup. Michael Bradley was a Cleveland Indian. It wasn't even a Guardian yet. They hadn't changed the name of the team.
They did not have 9 prospects that came back and just got better, like Getz suggested.
No, and they have had guys. Miles Straw was their center fielder at one point. Miles Straw couldn't hit me if I spotted him a baseball bat and stood perfectly still. Okay, they had guys that were failed prospects. They had guys that didn't pan out. But they also spent a lot of money on a number 1 pitcher. They spent a lot of money on a DH/right fielder who was the glue guy in the middle of their lineup, okay, and was one of the ultimate professionals in Michael Bradley. There have been no teams that you can point to that have been successful where every single starting player, every single key contributor was a prospect of theirs that came up through the farm system, came up through their international signings, or was even a guy that they traded for as a minor leaguer. It doesn't happen. But there are plenty of teams that have been successful where the guys that were brought in were not superstars, where the guys that were brought in were solid professional players that were able to help the guys that were learning on the job, that were able to provide stability in the lineup, that were able to provide stability in the rotation by being a guy that goes out at least once every 5 days and has a better than average chance of winning because they're not susceptible to some of the breakdowns. They're not susceptible to some of the things that go on with young pitchers. That's the kind of thing that you're talking about. And you can do that on a low payroll very easily if Chris Getz goes out and signs the right talent.
$50 million, Ed. He can have $50 million to play with pre-Crochet arbitration. He can have $40 million to play with pre-Crochet arbitration if he stupidly decides to bring back Vaughn and Nicky Lopez, which I think is stupid.
For $50 million, you can get at least 7 very good replacement level or above average professional veterans to fill in this roster.
Or you can add easily 2 middle of the order guys and then fill in with 1 or 2 other people if you wanted to. But you could go out, and I'm not saying Juan Soto. I'm just saying you can go get yourself a $12 or $13 million a year free agent. You can get 2 of those. You can go get yourself 2 more Benintendis. I mean, I would want them to be better, but I mean, go get yourself 2 $15 million guys in the middle of your order.
Yeah, you don't have to cross the $100 million threshold.
Just have a couple of professional baseball players to build around. You could still build, and you could still reduce the payroll. It's up to Chris Getz to go into Jerry Reinsdorf's office, say, I completely get it, boss. I completely understand. Can you give me a number? Because I'm thinking you're probably going to be at somewhere around, we're going to go down to 100 million? No, Chris, it's going to be closer to 93. Okay, I'll take 93. And then go to work cutting people off this team and making your $50 million pot that you can use this offseason to reshape your team. There is no excuse for Chris Getz, even with a payroll reduction. The way that this team is set up with very little in terms of guys that he is locked into, that he is married to, and very little money that is automatically promised, he has an incredible amount of payroll flexibility to have an impact. Coming back with the same guys is an absolute, unmitigated failure on the part of Chris Getz, no matter what Jerry Reinsdorf does.
Socks in the basement. Socks in the basement. Socks in the basement.
Socks in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on socksinthebasement.com.